Good evening, I'm Jim Lehrer. On the NewsHour tonight, full coverage of the indictment of the Vice President's Chief of Staff, Libby, including excerpts from a statement by the special prosecutor and the analysis of Mark Shields and David Brooks. The other news of this day will be at the end of the program tonight.
Major funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer has been provided by...
Somewhere west of Shenyang, a teenager is stopping for dinner, which is why the soybean harvest west of Peoria is not stopping, and a soybean processor is not stopping, and a ship's captain on the west coast is stopping, but just for a while. Somewhere west of Shenyang, a teenager is stopping for dinner, a dinner rich in soy protein. At ADM, we like the idea there'll be no stopping him now. ADM, resourceful by nature.
The golden years when life was you.
Wasn't always like this, believe me. I almost lost my shirt when my business hit the wall in 1984. We didn't take a vacation for years. Our financial guy helped us find the way back. But it's been a long road here. We're not taking anything for granted.
Smith Barney, this is who we are. This is how we earn it.
And by CIT and Pacific Life.
This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
The Vice President's Chief of Staff was indicted today in the CIA leak investigation. Louis Scooter Libby immediately resigned. The indictment accused him of obstructing justice, committing perjury before a federal grand jury, and making false statements to federal agents, 5 counts in all. Libby was not charged with actually leaking the name of CIA operative Valerie Plame in 2003. Her husband, former Ambassador Joseph Wilson, challenged pre-war intelligence about Iraq. The leak sparked the investigation 2 years ago. In a written statement, Libby said he's confident he will be exonerated. Vice President Cheney did not speak publicly about the indictment, but also in a written statement, he praised Libby's years of public service, and he said, "I have accepted his decision to resign with deep regret." He went on to say, "An accused person is presumed innocent until a contrary finding is made by a jury. Mr. Libby is entitled to that opportunity." Later, President Bush had this to say as he left the White House to go to Camp David for the weekend.
Scooter's worked tirelessly on behalf of the American people and sacrificed much in the service to this country. He served the Vice President and me through extraordinary times in our nation's history. Special Counsel Fitzgerald's investigation and ongoing legal proceedings are serious. And now the process moves into a new phase. While we're all saddened by today's news, we remain wholly focused on the many issues and opportunities facing this country. I got a job to do, and so do the people who work in the White House. We got a job to protect the American people, and that's what we'll continue working hard to do. I look forward to working with Congress on policies to keep this economy moving. And pretty soon I'll be naming somebody to the Supreme Court.
Mr. Bush's top aide, Karl Rove, was not indicted today, but his lawyer said Rove was told he remains under investigation. He appeared upbeat as he went to work this morning.
Mr. Rove, what's your mood today?
I'm going to have a great Friday and a fantastic weekend. Hope you do too.
Leading Democrats charge the real story goes far beyond Louis Libby. Senate Minority Leader Reid said it's about how the Bush White House manufactured and manipulated intelligence in order to bolster its case for the war in Iraq and to discredit anyone who dared to challenge the president. The special counsel in the case, Patrick Fitzgerald, said today the substantial bulk of his work is complete, but he added it's not over. Special Prosecutor Fitzgerald spoke for over an hour at his news conference this afternoon, outlining the case behind the Libby indictment and then taking questions about it. Here are extended excerpts.
A few hours ago, a federal grand jury sitting in the District of Columbia returned a 5-count indictment against I. Louis Libby, also known as Scooter Libby, the Vice President's Chief of Staff. The grand jury's indictment charges that Mr. Libby committed 5 crimes. The indictment charges 1 count of obstruction of justice of the federal grand jury, 2 counts of perjury, and 2 counts of false statements. Before I talk about those charges and what the indictment alleges, I'd like to put the investigation into a little context. Valerie Wilson was a CIA officer. In July 2003, the fact that Valerie Wilson was a CIA officer was classified. Not only was it classified, but it was not widely known outside the Intelligence Committee. Valerie Wilson's friends, neighbors, college classmates had no idea she had another life. The fact that she was a CIA officer was not well known for her protection or for the benefit of all of us. It's important that if a CIA officer's identity be protected, that it be protected not just for the officer, but for the nation's security. Valerie Wilson's cover was blown in July 2003. The first sign of that cover being blown was when Mr. Novak published a column on July 14, 2003. But Mr. Novak was not the first reporter to be told that Wilson's wife, Valerie Wilson, Ambassador Wilson's wife, Valerie, worked at the CIA. Several other reporters were told. In fact, Mr. Libby was the first official known to have told a reporter when he talked to Judith Miller in June of 2003 about Valerie Wilson. When it was clear that Valerie Wilson's cover had been blown, an investigation began. And in October 2003, the FBI interviewed Mr. Libby. Mr. Libby is the Vice President's Chief of Staff. He's also an assistant to the President and assistant to the Vice President for National Security Affairs. The focus of the interview was what was it that he had known about Wilson's wife, Valerie Wilson, what he knew about Ms. Wilson, what he said to people, why he said it, and how he learned it. And to be frank, Mr. Libby gave the FBI a compelling story. What he told the FBI is that essentially he was at the end of a long chain of phone calls. He spoke to a reporter, Tim Russert, and during the conversation, Mr. Russert told him that, hey, do you know that all the reporters know that Mr. Wilson's wife works at the CIA? And he told the FBI that he learned that information as if it were new, and it struck him. So he took this information from Mr. Russert, and later on he passed it on to other reporters, including reporter Matthew Cooper of Time magazine, reporter Judith Miller of the New York Times. And he told the FBI that when he passed the information on July 12th of 2003, 2 days before Mr. Novak's column, that he passed it on understanding that this was information he had gotten from a reporter, that he didn't even know if it was true. And he told the FBI that when he passed the information on to the reporters, he made clear that he did not know if this were true. This was something that all the reporters were saying, and in fact, he just didn't know. He wanted to be clear of that. Later, Mr. Libby went before the grand jury. On 2 occasions in March of 2004, he took an oath and he testified. And he essentially said the same thing. He said that, in fact, he had learned from the Vice President earlier in June 2003 information about Wilson's wife, but he had forgotten it. Now, he learned the information from Mr. Russert during this phone call. He learned it as if it were new. And when he passed the information on to reporters Cooper and Miller late in the week, he passed it on thinking it was just information he received from reporters, and that he told the reporters that, in fact, he didn't even know if it were true. He was just passing gossip from one reporter to another at the long end of a chain of phone calls. It would be a compelling story that would lead the FBI to go away if only it were true. It is not true, according to the indictment. In fact, Mr. Libby discussed the information about Valerie Wilson at least half a dozen times before this conversation with Mr. Russert ever took place. Not to mention that when he spoke to Mr. Russert and he never discussed Valerie Wilson or Wilson's wife. He didn't learn it from Mr. Russert, and if he had, it would not have been new at the time. Let me talk you through what the indictment alleges. The indictment alleges that Mr. Libby learned the information about Valerie Wilson at least 3 times in June of 2003 from government officials. And let me make clear there was nothing wrong with government officials discussing Valerie Wilson or Mr. Wilson or his wife in imparting the information to Mr. Libby. But in early June, Mr. Libby learned about Valerie Wilson and the role she was believed to play in having sent Mr. Wilson on a trip overseas from a senior CIA officer on or around June 11th, from an undersecretary of state on or around June 11th, and from the vice president on or about June 12th. It's also clear, as set forth in the indictment, that sometime prior to July 8th, he also learned it from somebody else working in the vice president's office. So at least 4 people within the government told Mr. Libby about Valerie Wilson, often referred to as Wilson's wife, working at the CIA and believed to be responsible for helping organize a trip that Mr. Wilson took overseas. In addition to hearing it from government officials, it's also alleged in the indictment that at least 3 times Mr. Libby discussed this information with other government officials. It's alleged in the indictment that on June 14th of 2003, a full month before Mr. Novak's column, Mr. Libby discussed it in a conversation with the CIA briefer, in which he was complaining to the CIA briefer his belief that the CIA was leaking information about something or making critical comments, and he brought up Joe Wilson and Valerie Wilson. It's also alleged in the indictment that Mr. Libby discussed it with the White House press secretary on July 7th, 2003, over lunch. What's important about that is that Mr. Libby, the indictment alleges, was telling Mr. Fleischer something on Monday that he claims to have learned on Thursday. In addition to discussing it with the press secretary on July 7th, there was also a discussion on or about July 8th, in which counsel for the vice president was asked a question by Mr. Libby as to what paperwork the Central Intelligence Agency would have if an employee had a spouse go on a trip. So there are at least 7 discussions involving government officials prior to the day when Mr. Libby claims he learned this information as if it were new from Mr. Russert, and in fact, when he spoke to Mr. Russert, they never discussed it. But in addition to focusing on how it is that Mr. Libby learned this information and what he thought about it, it's important to focus on what it is that Mr. Libby said to the reporters. And the account he gave to the FBI and to the grand jury was that he told reporters Cooper and Miller at the end of the week on July 12th. Now, what he told them was he gave them information that he got from other reporters. That other reporters were saying this, that Mr. Libby did not know if it were true, and in fact, Mr. Libby testified that he told the reporters he did not even know if Mr. Wilson had a wife. And in fact, we now know that Mr. Libby discussed this information about Valerie Wilson at least 4 times prior to July 14th, 2003. On 3 occasions with Judith Miller of the New York Times, and on 1 occasion with Matthew Cooper of Time magazine. The first occasion on which Mr. Libby discussed it with Judith Miller was back in June 23rd of 2003, just days after an article appeared online in the New Republic, which quoted some critical commentary from Mr. Wilson. After that discussion with Judith Miller on June 23rd, 2003, Mr. Libby also discussed Valerie Wilson on July 8th of 2003. And during that discussion, Mr. Libby talked about Mr. Wilson in a conversation that was on background as a senior administration official. And when Mr. Libby talked about Wilson, he changed the attribution to a former Hill staffer. During that discussion, which was to be attributed to a former Hill staffer, Mr. Libby also discussed Wilson's wife, Valerie Wilson, working at the CIA. And then finally, again, on July 12th. In short, and in those conversations, Mr. Libby never said, this is something that other reporters are saying. Mr. Libby never said, this is something that I don't know if it's true. Mr. Libby never said, I don't even know if she had a wife. At the end of the day, what appears is that Mr. Libby's story, that he was at the tail end of a chain of phone calls, passing on from one reporter what he heard from another, was not true. It was false. He was at the beginning of the chain of the phone calls, the first official to disclose this information outside the government to a reporter, and that he lied about it afterwards, under oath and repeatedly.
Mr. Fitzgerald, this began as a leak investigation, but no one is charged with any leaking. Is your investigation finished? Is this another leak investigation that doesn't lead to a charge of leaking?
Let me answer the two questions you asked in one. Okay, is the investigation finished? It's not over, but I'll tell you this. Very rarely do you bring a charge in a case that's going to be tried, and would you ever end a grand jury investigation? I can tell you the substantial bulk of the work in this investigation is concluded. This grand jury's term has expired by statute. It could not be extended, but it's an ordinary course to keep a grand jury open to consider other matters, and that's what we will be doing. Let me then ask your next question. Well, why is this leak investigation that doesn't result in a charge? As you sit here now, if you're asking me what his motives were, I can't tell you. We haven't charged him. So what you were saying is the harm in an obstruction investigation is it prevents us from making the very fine judgments we want to make. But I also want to take away from the notion that somehow we should take an obstruction charge less seriously than a leak charge. This is a very serious matter, and compromising national security information is a very serious matter. But the need to get to the bottom of what happened and whether national security was compromised by inadvertence, by recklessness, by maliciousness is extremely important. We need to know the truth. And anyone who would go into a grand jury and lie, obstruct, and impede the investigation has committed a serious crime. I will say this: Mr. Libby is presumed innocent. He would not be guilty unless and until a jury of 12 people came back and returned a verdict saying so. But if what we allege in the indictment is true, then what is charged is a very, very serious crime that will vindicate the public interest in finding out what happened here. Yes, sir.
Mr. Fitzgerald, do you have any evidence that the Vice President of the United States, one of Mr. Libby's original sources for this information, encouraged him to leak it or encouraged him to lie about leaking it?
I'm not making allegations about anyone, nor charging the indictment. Now let me back up, because I know what that sounds like to people if they're sitting at home. We don't talk about people that are not charged with a crime in the indictment. I would say that about anyone in this room who has nothing to do with the offenses. We make no allegation that the Vice President committed any criminal act. We make no allegation that any of the other people who provided or discussed with Mr. Libby committed any criminal act. But as to any person you asked me a question about other than Mr. Libby, I'm not going to comment on anything.
Is Karl Rove off the hook, and are there any other individuals who might be charged? You say you're not quite finished.
And all I can say is the same answer I gave before. If you ask me any name, I'm not going to comment on anyone named because we either charge someone or we don't talk about them, and don't read that answer in the context of the name you gave me.
A lot of Americans, people who are opposed to the war, critics of the administration, have looked to your investigation with hope in some ways and might see this indictment as a vindication of their argument that the administration took the country to war on false premises. Does this indictment do that?
This indictment is not about the war. This indictment is not about the propriety of the war. And people who believe fervently in the war effort, people who oppose it, people who have mixed feelings about it, should not look to this indictment for any resolution of how they feel or any vindication of how they feel. This is simply an indictment that says in a national security investigation about the compromise of a CIA officer's identity that may have taken place in the context of a very heated debate over the war, whether a person, Mr. Libby, lied or not. The indictment will not seek to prove that the war was justified or unjustified. This is stripped of that debate, and this is focused on a narrow transaction. And I think anyone who's concerned about the war and has feelings for or against shouldn't look to this criminal process for any answers or resolution of that. They will be frustrated, and frankly, it wouldn't be good for the process and the fairness of a trial.
That was Special Counsel Fitzgerald speaking this afternoon. More now from Margaret Warner.
And to analyze these indictments and the legal case against Louis Libby, we're joined by two experienced prosecutors. Robert Ray worked for and as an independent counsel on the Whitewater, Monica Lewinsky, and White House Travel Office investigations during the Clinton years. Previously, he and Patrick Fitzgerald served together as assistant U.S. attorneys with the Southern District of New York. Richard Benveniste served as assistant U.S. attorney during the Watergate scandal and was chief counsel for the Democrats on the Senate Whitewater Committee. Welcome to you both. Mr. Ray, as a former prosecutor, how does this case look to you?
Well, it's the beginning of the process. An indictment has been returned, as we're always taught as prosecutors and reminded by judges. The indictment, in some sense, to the trial process means nothing. It's simply an accusation, and it's the commencement of legal proceedings. Obviously, this is what we refer to as a speaking indictment, and we now know a little bit more than we did before about
I'm sorry, what does the speaking indictment mean?
Well, it means something more than just the allegations involving, the bare-bone charge, but explain, as Mr. Fitzgerald did at the press conference, a little bit more about the context under which he alleges that false statements, obstruction of justice, and perjury have been committed.
So, Mr. Benveniste, based on what's laid out in these indictments right in front of you and what you heard Fitzgerald say, as another former prosecutor, how strong a case does this look? Is this a hand you'd like to play?
Well, I think what we heard today was a piece of an opening statement at the trial. As Robert said, this indictment lays out the facts in chapter and verse in a dispassionate but very detailed way. It lays out the fact that from 4 separate independent sources within the government, Mr. Libby received information about Mr. Wilson and his wife, yet in statements to the FBI and then subsequent statements on 2 occasions under oath before the grand jury, he claimed that he first learned this information from the press, from 3 different individuals in the press who he claimed he had no knowledge about the underlying facts before he heard that information from the press. And it sounds like Mr. Fitzgerald would argue that he thought he could safely hide behind and disguise the true facts because he never believed that the individuals from the media with whom he had these discussions would ever testify about them.
So, Mr. Ray, how hard or easy will it be to take this case to trial, to prove this at trial, given just the evidence that is laid out in the indictments?
I think it's safe to say that perjury cases and false statements cases are very difficult to prove because they're not simply about proving that statements that were made were false. You have to go further and you have to prove that at the time the statements were made, they were intentionally false. In this particular case, though, Prosecutor Fitzgerald has laid out a case that is not simply about allegations involving an isolated occurrence or 2, but he emphasized at his press conference this afternoon that the critical component of those allegations, which is the sum and substance of the obstruction charge, that what is alleged here was a repeated effort to mislead first investigators and then the grand jury.
And so, Mr. Benveniste, does that make it, just follow up on what he said, does that make it easier to prove or more complicated to prove?
Well, it makes it easier to prove because the defense will be that this was an honest mistake if in fact it is shown that the statements he made were inaccurate or false. Then the question is whether they were knowingly false and whether the information that was alleged to be false was material to the investigation. In all of those instances, the prosecutor has now laid out the reason why they were important and material and the reason why it would not be credible to believe that this was inadvertent since it was repeated and since there were so many different sources within the government for that information. How could Mr. Libby have been mistaken in thinking he received that information in the first instance from the press? This was a detailed investigation of Mr. Wilson and his family and his connections, and as the result of that, he was armed with information which he then subsequently, according to this indictment, discussed with the press.
So you're saying, in other words, the prosecutor would argue, look at all these conversations that he had with other members of the administration, and he'd bring them all in to testify, and then say, so how could he come in and tell the grand jury that the first he heard of it was from Tim Russert, and he never even discussed it with Tim Russert?
That's right. Mr. Russert has said that he'd never had that conversation, as well as the other individuals with whom Mr. Libby apparently testified. He learned about the connection of Mrs. Wilson when in fact those individuals claimed that he was the source of that information.
Robert Ray, how would you defend if Scooter Libby were your client? What is the defense here?
What the prosecutor is looking to do is to show, as I've suggested, a pattern of activity. And the allegations, therefore, center around, on the back end, the discussions that Mr. Libby allegedly had with more than one reporter. Now, it's not just simply Judith Wilson, not simply Tim Russert, but Mr. Cooper, and so it's really the combination of all those things. Mm-hmm. I think it still obviously would be a case defended, as every one of these cases would be defended, on the question of intent, that was not his intention, and that his effort was not to mislead investigators, and that there was a failure of recollection that ultimately played out in terms of the multiple statements that he made, but that what he was not trying to do here was to violate the law.
Mr. Ray, also explain what, and reporters asked this several times this afternoon, Fitzgerald said her job, Valerie Wilson's job, the fact of her job at the agency was classified. And he also alleged that Scooter Libby told several reporters about it, people not authorized to know this. Why wouldn't he bring a charge of disclosing classified information?
Mr. Fitzgerald pointedly declined to answer that question. And there really can be only two reasons why he would have not brought charges here in connection with the types of statutes that you're describing. One possibility is that he may have concluded simply that he didn't have sufficient evidence to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. The second may be, even assuming that he could prove it, he may have decided to exercise his discretion not to charge those offenses. A good prosecutor knows when to say enough, and the worst mistake you can make is overcharge a case. In connection with, for example, the classified information statute, I think most observers of that statute have correctly pointed out that that statute sweeps rather broadly, and it gets into questions as a matter of discretion as to which cases are appropriate to prosecute given the vagaries of our system of classifying information and unclassifying or declassifying information. It's hard to pick and choose and divide lines between, you know, what's over the line and what isn't, and also it bumps up against the legitimate parameters of the First Amendment and the need of the press to know information that involves the operation of the highest levels of government.
I would agree with that, Margaret, in that, and I think Pat Fitzgerald explicitly discussed the fact that this is a very broad statute and that he did not feel that it was appropriate under the circumstances of this case to use it. And this is a statute that can have a terribly chilling effect on the ability of individuals to discuss important matters with the press that warrant discussion. This case has turned everything on its head. It's turned whistleblowers on its head because you have someone who is trying to hide behind non-disclosure by the press and use the press as a shield for his own information.
Briefly, let me just ask you, how did you read his language, Fitzgerald's, and body language about continuing this investigation?
I think I can answer that.
All right.
The body language that I saw, which I think has escaped some attention, is that while it is nominally true that Mr. Rove remains under investigation, I think the signal was quite clear that if there is a cloud hanging over Mr. Rove, it is very far in the distance now. And if anything, I'm sure that Mr. Rove has breathed a heavy sigh of relief and can go back to doing what he was doing before this investigation commenced.
And briefly, do you agree?
I do agree. I think that the substantive part of the investigation is more or less wrapped up, but a grand jury will be utilized, Mr. Fitzgerald said, if more information comes forward. He has also indicated that Mr. Rove is still under investigation.
All right, Richard Benvenisti and Robert Ray, thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Now to Ray Suarez with more on Louis Libby.
So who is Louis Scooter Libby? We'll get some answers from two journalists who've recently written about Libby and his role in the administration and in the Iraq War. Mark Leibovich is a reporter for the Washington Post and author of a recent profile of Libby, and George Packer is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of the new book, The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq. George Packer, does that title, Vice Presidential Chief of Staff, adequately get at Louis Libby's stature within the Vice President's office and in the White House as a whole?
It doesn't. He is his Chief of Staff and probably the most powerful Vice Presidential Chief of Staff in history. He's also his Chief National Security Advisor. But Libby is a protege not of Cheney but of Paul Wolfowitz, and they go back to 1972 when Wolfowitz taught at Yale and Libby was a student of his. Wolfowitz brought Libby to Washington in '81 to work in the Reagan State Department, and then brought him again into government in '89 when Wolfowitz became the number 3 at the Pentagon under Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney. Libby became his deputy. And Wolfowitz and Libby worked very closely together, among other things, developing an Iraq war plan after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait that eerily resembled Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. It called for a move into Iraq, deep into Iraq, by a light force. That was eventually scrapped, but it gave you an idea of the kind of thinking that Wolfowitz and Libby shared. And then once again, in 1992, Cheney deputized Wolfowitz and Libby to oversee the drafting of what came to be called the Defense Planning Guidance, which was a broad look at post-Cold War American defense and military policy, which again foreshadowed the Bush doctrine of preempting threats and creating such American military power that there would be no rivals, that we would deter all rivals. So in a way, to understand how Libby got to where he is today, you have to look at the history of Paul Wolfowitz.
Mark Leibovich, Vice President Cheney is often described as one of the most powerful and influential vice presidents in history. Did Vice President Cheney's clout enhance Lewis Libby?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think you become the most powerful vice presidential aide perhaps in history if you don't have the perhaps most powerful vice president in history to answer to. I mean, he also has a third title in addition to Chief of Staff and National Security Advisor to Cheney, which is Assistant to the President. And Scooter Libby, unlike really any vice presidential deputy in recent memory, is treated very much like a principal within the White House, which means that he goes to very high-level meetings, whether it's on the economy and even more commonly on national security. So certainly, I mean, their fortunes are very intertwined, and Libby is a very, very dominant figure, not just in Vice President Cheney's office, but in the White House at large.
Well, Mark, take us back to 2002 and 2003, when Ambassador Joe Wilson made his trip to Africa, when the administration was making its case for war. What was Scooter Libby doing?
Well, he clearly was part of the administration that was making the case for war. I mean, he was certainly a hawk within the administration. I mean, he and Wolfowitz, who, as George has said, they go back many, many decades, were true believers. And Scooter Libby has had Saddam Hussein on his radar for many decades. His portfolio during the first Gulf War at the Pentagon included germ warfare and the biochemical or the biological capabilities of Saddam Hussein. And that really crystallized a lot of interest for him for many, many years. And he's also, like Cheney, been someone who's been very, very interested in terrorism for many, many years, certainly preceding September 11th. And the two of them really do share a worldview, which is that there is evil in the world and it must be dealt with swiftly. And they're both students of history, and they've met with the same historians and talked to the same historians. And certainly Libby was a very fierce advocate of the president's case for going to war in 2002 and 2003.
Well, George Packer, did Lewis Libby have specific tasks during that time that he performed either in a way that could be seen by the public or was instrumental behind the scenes?
I think precisely he was not seen by the public. He was the soul of discretion, sort of the ultimate behind-the-scenes official. He was Cheney's Cheney. He was crucially placed to receive intelligence and policy ideas from his colleagues and neoconservative allies at the Pentagon, starting with Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, and those who worked under them in the policy office. And I think that is a role that the public doesn't really know very much about. And it also involves some of the post-war planning, most of which, the blame for which has been laid at the feet of the Pentagon, not the Vice President's office. But perhaps as this case unfolds, we're going to have the veil lifted on the Vice President's office, and we'll find out exactly what role that office played in some of the mistakes that were made as we went to war in Iraq.
Well, Mark, you just heard George Packer call this person Cheney's Cheney and talk about him as a behind-the-scenes person. Today in the indictment, a lot of phone calls with reporters were spelled out and described in exhaustive detail. What was this behind-the-scenes guy doing burning up the phone lines during 2003?
Well, I mean, being behind the scenes certainly doesn't preclude having deep background, conversations with a lot of reporters. I mean, being behind the scenes is also not synonymous with being a shrinking violet. I mean, Libby has been extremely aggressive in courting the press. I mean, a lot of members of the press know him fairly well. He's always very polite, very, very solicitous. He often returns calls. but again, it's always on the background, and I don't think he, in his wildest imagination, believed that such a detailed cataloging of his conversations with reporters would come to light as it has. So, you know, Vice President Cheney, you know, despite his behind-the-scenes career, or at least perceived to be as sort of a loyal behind-the-scenes player, has courted the press also. So that's certainly part of his job. And, you know, just as Vice President Cheney doesn't have a specific area in the White House, he's been given the freedom and the power by the president to kind of freelance and look around at whatever interests him and whatever the president has assigned him to. I mean, Libby is the same way.
Well, let's talk a little bit more specifically about the mentioning of Ambassador Wilson and his connection to Valerie Wilson. Would that have been also something that falls into his portfolio, damage control or you know, payback?
Well, I certainly can't speak to his motives, but obviously, you know, their arguing against dissent for the invasion was a big part of what they were concerned about on a day-to-day basis. You know, whether Joe Wilson was an actual threat to public or was actual an influencer of public opinion, or whether he wasn't, is, you know, anybody's analysis. But clearly, I mean, if you look at the records and if you look at people who have spoken to Libby, I mean, clearly Joe Wilson was someone he was preoccupied with, and I think it was part of a larger, you know, for lack of a better term, marketing effort to sell the administration's point of view, which happened to fly in the face of some of the things that Joe Wilson was saying and writing also.
George Packer today, the Vice President. Yeah, go ahead.
Libby was part of something called the White House Iraq Group, which was set up in the summer of 2002 to prepare the public for the coming war in Iraq. It was very much a public relations effort to make the case for war. Libby was a core member of that group, so that definitely fell within his portfolio in the Vice President's office.
Is this, George Packer, a big loss for the Vice President?
I think it has to be considered a tremendous loss. Libby has been at his side in all the key decisions since September 11th. He was at those meetings in Camp David when the response to 9/11 was debated. He and Paul Wolfowitz were the first to argue for an attack on Iraq after September 11th. He had a lot invested, therefore, in the Iraq war. Cheney had a lot invested in him, and I think his departure has to be a great blow to the Vice President.
George Packer, Mark Leibovich, thank you both. Jim?
Thank you, Ray. Now how all of this looks to Shields and Brooks. Syndicated columnist Mark Shields, New York Times columnist David Brooks. David, just in general, what do you think of this action today against Louis Libby?
Well, the crucial fact that is about Louis Libby. This is not quite the lone leaker, but this is about really the actions of one individual. The danger for the White House was always going to be that there would be a perception there's a cancer on the White House, that there'd be a conspiracy involving Rove and maybe several other people. It's now clear there aren't going to be indictments about several other people, and as the prosecutor said, probably not about Rove. And so we've had somebody, a great prosecutor, Fitzgerald, look for 22 months into this administration with all sorts of access, and he's found there's no sort of broad conspiracy. So while this is certainly a bad day for the administration, it's in a day that the administration will probably survive because there is no sort of cancer on the presidency.
How do you see it, Mark?
Well, Jim, I think that you can make the case that Louis Libby was a high enough person in the White House, an influential and independent enough person, based on Ray's excellent interview with Mark Leibovich and George Packer, that he could operate on his own. He was a single operator. But at the same time, he was a loyal staff man. And there's very little question that what he was about, he wasn't on a rogue mission. I mean, he was trying to shoot down the criticism of the very premise for going to war that Joe Wilson raised, and they did it in a way that, quite frankly, was reckless in terms of Victoria Plain. So I think it gives you an indication of just how committed ideologically, even though undeflected by reality and evidence and experience, these people were about that Iraqi war.
David, do you think that the war, like it or not, is going to become part of this trial in a major way beyond Louis Libby as an individual?
No, I really don't. Fitzgerald said very clearly this is not about the war. This is about somebody who allegedly lied to some reporters and then most importantly, lied to the grand jury. So this is not about the larger issue of going to war. Joe Wilson isn't really even about that. It's about the trip to Niger, which was off to the side about whether Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And I'll be honest, when I look at Scooter, someone I know, I've gone to lunch with him a couple times, and he's always been a terrible source because he's never told me anything. But one of the things I will always wonder about him is why was he so obsessed with Joe Wilson? There were many broad issues about WMDs. Everybody thought Saddam had him going in, Democrat or Republican. We now know that was untrue, but Joe Wilson was sort of off to the side. So why was Scooter so obsessed talking to so many reporters over such a long period of time about him? I still find that mystifying.
Senator Reid, David said this today, that this is, quote, about how the Bush White House manufactured and manipulated intelligence in order to bolster its case for the war in Iraq and to discredit anyone who dared to challenge the president. You disagree with Senator Reid?
Well, no, I really think this is a case of overreaching, almost a case of paranoia and sort of conspiracy mongering. We've had a prosecutor, who's a very good prosecutor, go for 22 months in this administration with more cooperation than any reporter's ever had, anybody's ever had before. If there was a big conspiracy here, surely he would have had, A, some indictments about the underlying crime, and surely he would have had more people than Scooter Libby. But when you listen to that press conference, it was about one person, and it was about somebody calling a series of reporters, not about a big conspiracy, not about broader issues. It was about obstructing justice at the grand jury.
Mark? You see it differently.
I do see it differently. I agree with David on Patrick Fitzgerald. I mean, I thought that what he did today was truly impressive. I mean, you saw a large slice of it in the opening part of the show, but this is somebody who stepped with no notes, no teleprompter, and in total command of the facts, but with no arrogance and no cockiness, and was quite disarming in the way he dodged questions, said, "Look, I'm not going to answer that," ducked it, and everything else. But I thought he made a very, very strong case. But what he showed more than anything else was this enormous respect for the law, that he would not go beyond where the law took him. I mean, that's what he was about, and that's what his career has been about. But remember the official...
In other words, if somebody's going to make the conspiracy charge, Patrick Fitzgerald isn't going to make it, but you think it's still there to be made.
I think, well, David doesn't need to be reminded. The official White House position, repeated time and again by the principal spokesman, the president's spokesman, was that Karl Rove and Scooter Libby and Elliot Abrams had never been involved in these leaks at all, and that each of them had assured him, Scott McCollum, and presumably the president, that they had not been involved in these leaks. Well, we know that's not the case. I mean, we know David's right. There was almost an obsession with Libby. I mean, he was talking to, according to Patrick Fitzgerald, he was talking to all manner of people about Joe Wilson's wife.
What does this, more generally, also picking up on what David said, that he doesn't believe that this really does that much damage to the White House itself, to the president, the vice president. It's strictly Scooter Libby. Do you?
I think, Jim, I mean, we understand this, that Dick Cheney is the most influential vice president in the history of the country. And Scooter Libby was the most influential chief of staff that a vice president's ever had. And as again in Ray's segment, he was an assistant to the president. He was somebody who was at all the meetings. He was at Camp David. You don't get a lot of vice presidential people showing up at Camp David on an irregular basis. So was he important? Was it as symbolically important as Karl Rove being indicted? Absolutely not. Karl Rove is the person that conservatives love as their champion, and that liberals loathe as a villain. That would have been a bigger story. But I think that if this goes to trial, I think the trial could, quite frankly, be a continuing source of embarrassment. And the irony here is, for a ordinary United States citizen to lie to federal officials is a crime. But for federal officials to lie to American people apparently is a matter of course. I mean, Karl Rove's still working at the White House. I mean, even though he lied to us and presumably lied to the president about his involvement.
What do you think about that, David?
Well, clearly there were lies told about Rove's role. But to me, the most damaging thing, the way I would look at the administration, the way I think a lot of Americans would look at the administration, was if they had really a rogue operation, which you really did see in the Nixon administration, sort of this rogue conspiracy to intentionally expose a covert operative for political gain. And if there were a bunch of people sitting around a room talking about this, then you really get a sense of malevolence. And frankly, when you looked at the run-up to these indictments, all the focus was on Rove. There was talk about 5 indictments, And if that had happened, this would have been a cataclysmic, really credibility ending day for the administration. But as it is, as I say, it's a bad day. Scooter Libby was a very important person in that administration, but it's not a credibility ending because it is so much about one person's action.
David, what about the issue that was raised before today by some Republican senators even, that if the indictments, no matter who is indicted, if it's just for what they call technical things like perjury, obstruction of justice, and making false statements, that's not a big deal compared to what it would be of leaking classified information, etc. Where do you come down on that today?
Yeah, if anybody makes that argument after Fitzgerald's presentation at his press conference, the person is an idiot. I think Fitzgerald did a fantastic job of saying why this is an important thing. And the argument was, this is not something at the end of the judicial process. Telling the truth to a grand jury is the basis of the judicial process. So I think that argument died today.
You agree with that, Mark?
I do agree with David. And one of the things David wrote this week, and other people have as well, but David made a very strong case that in the second term of the administration, the Bush administration in this case, insulation, isolation, and exhaustion set in, and there's a need for change, the need for first blood, just as President Reagan did with bringing in Howard Baker. There'd been talk around town that maybe former Congressman Vin Weber, former Republican Senator Bill Cohen, somebody like that would come to the White House. I think as a consequence of today, when Karl Rove doesn't get a clean bill of health, but certainly dodged the bullet and wasn't indicted, that likelihood of that happening is less than it was.
You agree, David, that there's less chance now that there'll be this big change?
Well, yes, because if Rove had been indicted, he'd be out and there'd be forced change.
Yeah. Sure.
And now I agree with Mark about that. It does seem a lot less likely. Though I do, you know, when I talk about them surviving this day, I don't mean to say they should be banging the bongo drums and lighting up the cigars. They merely survived. They've still got a long way to go to climb back to where they were.
Do either of you have any inside word that you'd like to share, and I won't tell anybody if you do, about whether the president's made a decision on who he's going to replace as the nominee for Harriet Miers?
I do, but I'm sworn to say
Okay. No, I'm just wondering.
I don't.
You heard anything, David?
No, I think one has heard the arguments, and the president said today he's very close, and so I suspect it'll be somebody we've all heard of. He won't be taking any more big, risky chances. But I haven't heard that he hasn't whispered the name to me, though if he wants to call, he's got my number.
But, of course, my follow-up to that is, well, if he does something like that, like Monday, Tuesday, or whatever, is the dark cloud beginning to be removed from the top of the White House, do you think, taking this event today, Harriet Miers yesterday, and then stepping up to the plate and doing something Monday, Tuesday on the Harriet Miers issue? What do you think?
Well, look, I'd say look at two scenarios. One, Harriet Miers goes through and had the hearings, and she performed poorly, and add to that you get 4 or 5 indictments. That's the end of the administration, so that's one scenario. Right. The other scenario is that she withdraws and the president gets a chance to name someone who will probably do a little better in the hearings, and you only get 1 indictment. That's the reality scenario, and that's just a much better scenario for the administration than what we were looking at about a week ago.
Yeah. How do you see the cloud issue here?
Jim, these are rough seas politically. I mean, if he comes up with a 10 strike, John Roberts' long-lost identical twin, it's not going to say, I mean, look at, we just passed 2,000 killed in Iraq this week. 90% of them have been killed since the president announced mission accomplished. We saw a $10 billion profit for ExxonMobil yesterday, quarterly profit, a new record. People are paying for it at the gas pumps. People are paying more. We've got consumer confidence down, house prices down, or house values down, and at the same time we've got health costs up. And so, I mean, I don't know where, in the president's own numbers, the one loyal constituency that stuck with him are his conservatives. I mean, moderates and independents have deserted this president. So he's got very serious problems on every possible front.
What's your overview? Yeah, go ahead, David.
You mentioned one thing about the conservatives. To me, my main worry now is conservatives are overreading their victory when it comes to Harriet Miers. Listen, there was a Gallup poll that came out today. The reason why she was not favored by the majority of the American people was competence. It was not ideology. But a lot of conservative groups are reading this as a lesson. Now Bush really has to pick someone extremely conservative to please us because we really run this show. And to me, the president's bind now is that a lot of conservative groups, including responsible conservative groups, not just the wingnuts, have overread what just happened. And so that to me is a potential pitfall for the Republicans.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it there. Good to see you both. Thank you both. In the other news of this day, the U.S. military announced 3 more American soldiers and 2 U.S. Marines were killed in Iraq on Thursday. That made 78 American deaths in October, about 30 more than September. The total since the war began now stands at 2,010. Thousands of Iranians marched in Tehran today. They shouted support for their president's demand that Israel be wiped off the map. We have a report narrated by Lindsay Taylor of Independent Television News.
The scene on the streets of Tehran today as hardline supporters of the president celebrated Jerusalem Day. It was death to Israel, death to America. Some would say business as usual. But the sentiments have all the more impact now, courtesy of the man at the center of the storm. President Ahmadinejad joining the massive anti-Israeli rally. He was anything but repentant when an Iranian reporter asked about the machinations of the West and Zionist regime.
It's nothing new. They think they are the outright power, the world's rulers. Any voice calling for fairness and freedom which rears its head anywhere in the world is a threat to them. It's nothing new.
But if there was a recognition within the Iranian government that the president had gone too far, it came from outside the country. In Moscow, the embassy there issuing a statement saying,
Mr. Ahmadinejad did not have any intention to speak up in such sharp terms and enter into a conflict.
Even so, it was said, and it was said by Iran's president, prompting the UN Secretary General to take the unusual step of issuing a statement expressing his dismay. At Friday prayers there was a hint of moderation. The influential former President Rafsanjani spoke of solving issues through negotiations. The question is, will those words carry so well?
The U.S. House today condemned the Iranian president's statements, and the Vatican called the comments unacceptable. The UN warned today it will have to halt relief flights to earthquake survivors in Pakistan. A World Food Program official said there's only enough money to keep helicopters flying for 1 more week. This week, donor nations pledged $580 million, but so far, little of that money has arrived. Bit by bit, conditions in South Florida improved today in the wake of Hurricane Wilma. A steady stream of military cargo planes brought in food and water to hard-hit areas, and more businesses were able to reopen after getting power. More than 3.5 million people still have no electricity. The U.S. economy grew briskly in the 3rd quarter of this year despite hurricane damage. The Commerce Department reported that today. It said the gross domestic product expanded at an annual rate of 3.8% from July through September. That news lifted Wall Street. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained more than 172 points to close above 10,402. The NASDAQ rose 26 points to close above 2089. For the week, the Dow gained nearly 2%. The NASDAQ rose 0.4%. Congress agreed today to have Rosa Parks lie in honor at the U.S. Capitol building on Sunday and Monday. The civil rights pioneer will be the first woman accorded that tribute. Parks ignited the civil rights movement in 1955 when she refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama. She died Monday in Detroit at the age of 92. Again, the major story of this day. The Vice President's Chief of Staff, Louis Libby, resigned after being indicted by the CIA leaks grand jury. He was charged with lying to FBI agents, committing perjury before the grand jury, and obstruction of justice. President Bush said he was saddened by the news. Washington Week can be seen on most PBS stations later this evening. We'll see you online and again here Monday evening with, among other things, the final installment of our 30th anniversary series. It's the story of a Nebraska town's belief in military service. Have a nice weekend. I'm Jim Lehrer. Thank you and good night.
Major funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer has been provided by...
Sometimes success needs to be nurtured. Sometimes it wants to be pushed. Sometimes success takes everything we can give and then demands more. And sometimes all it takes is someone who sees what you see. At CIT, we're in the business of financing great ideas so you can take yours all the way to the top.
Each person has a unique way of seeing the world. That's why, for over 135 years, Pacific Life has offered the power of choice. Pacific Life provides a full palette of financial and estate planning solutions to help you achieve your vision of your future. Pacific Life, the power to help you succeed.
And by the Archer Daniels Midland Company, and by Smith Barney.
This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Who do you trust to tell all sides of a story? Who do you trust to let different voices be heard? Who do you trust to teach your children? Who do you trust to help make sense of it all? Americans trust PBS more than any other television network.
To purchase video cassettes of the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, call 1-866-678-NEWS.
I am PBS.